Perfect appearance, turbulent inner world. When I think of American flight attendants, the image in my mind is bright and polished. The tailored uniforms, a precise swipe of lipstick, hair pinned back with mathematical neatness, shoes always shining, and a signature smile that seems to promise the best of experiences at 30,000 feet. There's a kind of effortless grace about them, an almost cinematic confidence that makes passengers wonder if turbulence ever shakes their core. They often appear as the gold standard of composure, resilient, reliable, a little glamorous, and always in control. But let me be honest with you, all of that is just surface. I've spent enough time observing and even befriending some of these remarkable women to realize, behind every perfect flight attendant facade is a human being tucked away, layered in stories, desires, worries, hopes, and every flavor of raw emotion. Once the airplane doors close behind them after a shift, they step out of the heels and into ordinary lives. Lives that can be exhilarating, exhausting, vulnerable, or painfully lonely. Society asks them to bring their best selves to every flight, and in doing so, we sometimes forget that they have a whole spectrum of feelings: anger, disappointment, longing, failure, joy, that get hidden under their professional armor. Some days their badge might as well say, people pleaser, expert juggler, professional smiler, and silent sufferer. Imagine working across countless time zones, missing birthdays, anniversaries, or the chance to tuck your child in at night. Imagine, too, the small indignities, dealing with demanding passengers, being on the receiving end of strangers' prejudice, and the ever-present pressure to look flawless. The world sees an icon. I see, and want to show you, a real person straining under invisible weights. While passengers chase dreams and destinations, these women chase moments of quiet happiness. Phone calls home backstage in airport lounges, a solitary cup of coffee at 5 a.m. in a city that isn't home, a fleeting smile with a stranger in the security line that makes the day easier for a breath. And beneath it all, the one hope that lingers is the same as for anyone: the wish for genuine happiness. The challenge is, despite so much grace and poise, not all of them will find it. Tragedy, fate, and heartbreak can step across the jet bridge into their lives just as easily as for anyone else. That's where our story begins, a reminder that behind every composed greeting and polished uniform, a hidden world of feeling waits, and sometimes those feelings are the most turbulent of all. A fateful Sunday. It was a quiet Sunday, the kind of day when New York City's endless energy seemed to pause for breath, wrapped in the chilly early December air. Downtown, the shimmering facades of apartment buildings reflected the waning light, and inside one such building, the Reed family's apartment was eerily still. The tick of the clock in the hallway seemed to echo off the polished wood floors, accentuating rather than breaking the silence. For Emma Reed, the youngest of three sisters, that Sunday was supposed to be just another day. Maybe she'd sleep in, maybe she'd call her best friend, maybe she'd scroll through old pictures of her oldest sister Jessica, always so perfect in her navy blue Delta Airlines uniform. But something felt wrong. Jessica had been missing from home for days, and no one in the family had really noticed until now. After all, with her erratic schedule as a flight attendant, it was normal for her to pop in and out, sometimes gone for days at a time. Emma had always admired how calm and put together Jessica looked in her uniform. A sharp scarf knotted at her throat, hair pulled back in a flawless bun, her makeup subtle but always on point, lips curved in a gentle, reassuring smile. To the outside world, Jessica was the embodiment of confidence and competence. At home, she was the glue that held Emma and their middle sister Lily, studying abroad in London together. That Sunday, though, Emma felt a gnawing unease. As dusk fell and the apartment filled with grays and deepening shadows, Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by textbooks she wasn't actually reading, staring at her phone. It buzzed with a call that would tip her world upside down, a withheld number, a clipped, slightly worried voice on the other end. It was Linda Matthews, Jessica's supervisor from Delta. She hadn't checked in for her last flight. No one had seen or heard from her in days. Had something happened? Was the family aware of her whereabouts? Emma's heart hammered in her chest. At first she tried to reason it out. Maybe Jessica had traded shifts. Maybe she went on a spontaneous weekend trip. Maybe, just maybe, she had forgotten to call, busy as always. But deep down, she knew Jessica never forgot. She was the responsible one, the sister who texted everyone when she landed, who let them know what time she'd be home, who called their mom, Marjorie, every single Sunday morning, just to check in and hear about the latest gossip from back home. Emma scrambled to call Jessica's cell, no answer. She called her boyfriend, Marcus Walker, too, straight to voicemail. She started to panic, pacing between the bedrooms, racking her brain for any clue. She opened Jessica's door and scanned her sister's room. The bed was made, the closet doors closed, nothing out of place. But something was off. Jessica's carry-on suitcase and work tote, which she never left for a shift without, were missing. Her uniform was not hanging where it always did after a trip. The hours slipped by, the apartment growing ever colder and quieter. Emma couldn't sleep, cycling through hope and dread, checking her phone, willing it to vibrate with news. Around 2 a.m., her anxiety reached its breaking point. She began searching the apartment, desperate for any sign that would tell her what had happened. A note, a missed call, anything. She rifled through the laundry, checked the kitchen, the bathroom, and finally, in Jessica's room, she noticed the covers on the bed had been straightened, but the shape seemed odd, as if something was hidden underneath. Her palms sweating, Emma pulled back the comforter. Underneath, neatly folded, was Jessica's uniform blazer and scarf and the sensible navy heels she wore on every flight, but there was no sign of Jessica herself. Emma's mind raced. Why had Jessica left behind her uniform? Why weren't her usual travel bags here? She shook her parents awake, and together the family began to search every inch of their apartment. The sense of dread, cold and sticky, spread through the rooms with them, creeping up Emma's spine until she could barely breathe. Suddenly, Mr. Reed's voice rang out from the master bedroom closet. "She's here! I found something!" Emma rushed over, her stomach twisting in terror and her legs threatening to give way beneath her. The closet door stood open, and the sight that met her eyes made her world collapse into a roar of static and silence. That Sunday would never leave Emma. The ordinary had been shattered, replaced by a gaping hole in the Reed family's life that no clock, no supervisor's call, no comforting words could ever fill again. It was the day innocence bowed to fear, when every unreturned call and unanswered text message became a warning sign, echoing in the lives of those left behind. This was the day the light went out in their apartment, and Emma would spend years trying to understand how, despite all the routines and rituals of family life, something so unimaginable could unfold in their own home. Unusual signs. The days leading up to Jessica Reed's disappearance had been quietly unsettling, marked by a series of signals that, at the time, seemed innocuous but, in retrospect, would stand as glaring red flags. On that Monday, the 1st of December, everything had appeared normal. Jessica had returned from a flight, breezed through the kitchen with her usual cheerful greeting, and immediately started sorting laundry, a ritual she maintained after every trip. But what Emma remembered most clearly now was a subtle shift, a forced brightness in Jessica's smile, the way her laughter seemed hollow at dinner, and how she stared off into space longer than usual, lost in thoughts she wouldn't share. By midweek, small details began to unravel from Jessica's carefully maintained life. Emma noticed her sister's phone lighting up with repeated texts from an unknown number. Jessica would glance at the screen and quickly turn it over, her expression tightening. When Emma asked if everything was all right, Jessica brushed it off with a soft, "Oh, just work stuff. Schedule changes, you know." But Emma knew her sister. Jessica prided herself on transparency, and until then, had always been happy to share even the little frustrations of her job. Jessica's behavior became more erratic. For 2 days she barely touched her food, picking listlessly at her morning oatmeal, barely sipping her coffee. She closed herself off in her room for hours, the faint hum of her voice on the phone seeping through the door in urgent, whispered tones. When Emma knocked to ask if she wanted to watch their favorite crime drama together, Jessica barely looked up, apologizing and saying she had paperwork to finish. The final straw came on Thursday, December 4th. According to Delta's official policy, attendants were required to notify supervisors at least 2 hours before the start of their shift if they needed to call in sick. That afternoon, Jessica, sounding hoarse and strained, phoned in just 1 hour before her scheduled time, an uncharacteristic breach of protocol for someone so reliable. The digital log at Delta headquarters recorded Jessica's voice, subdued, almost trembling, requesting sick leave. It was a direct, if subtle, cry for help, one her manager, Linda Matthews, would later admit she had never expected from her shining employee. Emma and her parents tried to reach Jessica repeatedly that evening. Her phone would ring, then go straight to voicemail. Marcus, Jessica's boyfriend, reported that he hadn't heard from her since lunchtime, when she'd sent him a picture of herself in uniform, asking if he thought she looked nice. That seemed routine enough. Jessica loved small reassurances. But this time, it was different. The smile in the picture didn't reach her eyes. That night, as snow began to fall outside, Dusting the city in a cold, muffled quiet, Emma sat at the kitchen table, piecing together the events like the scattered pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. She noticed Jessica's work tote missing, her neatly arranged travel-sized toiletries still lined up in the bathroom, untouched. The small gold bracelet Jessica always wore had been left behind on the nightstand, a detail so unthinkable, it made Emma's breath catch. There was also the strange smell pervading the apartment that had started earlier that week. Emma's mother, Marjorie, had dismissed it as leftover takeout or the neighbor's cooking, but as days went by it grew stronger, unfamiliar, almost chemical. Nobody had thought much of it, after all, strange city smells were just a part of life in their building. But now, that assumption gnawed at Emma with a new intensity. As the hours dragged on without a word from Jessica, the abnormality of her silence began to overshadow everything else. This was not her sister. Jessica was always the one to check in, to update, to reassure. Emma's anxiety built with each unreturned phone call, every unanswered text, and she realized she was looking straight at something unthinkable. The subtle, overlooked signs of a life quietly unraveling. The fearful search. The night after Jessica Reed's supervisor called, a heavy sense of dread descended over the Reed apartment. Emma was restless. Her mind replayed the unanswered calls, the strange silence from her sister. Around 2:30 a.m., unable to bear the uncertainty, Emma finally woke her parents. Their mother, Marjorie, bleary-eyed and still hoping for a reasonable explanation, insisted that Jessica had to be fine. Maybe stranded by a flight delay, maybe visiting a friend. But their father, Walter, rifled through his daughter's recent messages and found nothing. No texts, no emails, no social media posts. Not even on the private family group chat where Jessica always posted she had landed safely. The silence was terrifying. The family divided up, moving anxiously from room to room. Emma started in Jessica's bedroom, looking for some overlooked clue, a crumpled note, a phone charger, maybe the lost bracelet. The sheets were perfectly smooth, almost too perfectly made, but Jessica's carry-on, the one she never let out of her sight, was missing. The closet was closed, but the faintest smell lingered in the air, unfamiliar and sharp, mixing with the lavender sachet Jessica used to keep her clothes fresh. Emma was seized by a sudden, irrational panic. She threw open the drawers, checked under the bed, behind the curtains, even in the bathroom's linen closet, her hands shaking all the while. Walter pounded on Jessica's door, calling out her name, his voice growing raw and desperate with each unanswered cry. Marjorie, for her part, tried to keep calm, but the fear in her eyes told its own story. She paced in and out of rooms, scanning for overlooked signs, the mug Jessica drank from, her slippers, her jacket, even though she knew she would find nothing new. With each search that turned up empty, the tension climbed higher, pressing in until it became physically painful. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, Walter stopped abruptly in front of the master bedroom closet. The door, oddly, was slightly ajar. He pulled it open, and what he saw drained the blood from his face. "Oh God, Emma, Marjorie, come here now!" His voice was shaking, barely more than a whisper. Emma arrived first, her whole body cold and numb before her mind caught up with her limbs. She dropped to her knees in shock. From beneath a pile of winter coats and old blankets, a pair of legs, utterly still and terrible in their paleness, protruded. For a split second, Emma's brain couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Marjorie gasped, frozen in the doorway. No one spoke. The world shrank to a single point of horror, silence roaring in their ears. Reality set in all at once. Walter pulled his wife back, his hands trembling as Emma staggered out of the room to dial 911. Her voice was high, barely coherent, telling the dispatcher there'd been an emergency, that they needed help, please now. The dispatcher's voice was calm, instructing Emma not to touch anything, that officers and EMTs were on their way. Emma dropped the phone and sat shaking on the hallway floor as the family tried to hold each other together, each parent instinctively reaching for their lost child, the one who kept everyone anchored. Staring at the shadowy hallway, Emma felt as though she was suspended in time. Every detail seared into her memory, the hum of the refrigerator, the blinking light of the answering machine, her father's strangled sobs. The police and rescue crews arrived in minutes, filling the quiet apartment with the harsh light of flashlights, the low hum of radios, and the heavy silence of profound tragedy. Yellow police tape went up across their doorway, neighbors peered out, confused and hushed. Detectives spoke in low voices to her parents, EMTs confirmed the worst. Through it all, Emma clung to the hall banister, her mind whirling, her eyes fixed on Jessica's now empty room. The search had ended, but the terror had only just begun. For Emma and the Reeds, the thin line between ordinary life and nightmare had been forever crossed, and no amount of searching could ever piece their world back together again. The haunting of the closet. From the moment the closet door was pulled open, nothing about the Reed home would ever feel safe again. For years, the cozy master bedroom closet had merely held out-of-season clothes, extra shoes, and the sort of harmless household clutter every family accumulates. But after that night, it became a dark landmark, a space forever etched into memory by terror and loss. Walter Reed stood in a stunned daze as police cordoned off the crime scene, his hand still trembling where it had brushed his daughter's lifeless ankle. As for Emma, she couldn't bring herself to move, her body pressing against the far wall of the hallway, heart pounding in her ears. She squeezed her eyes shut, but every time she blinked, she saw those pale legs, the navy skirt, and the frozen stillness punctured by horror. Marjorie, reeling, weeping, barely able to stand, kept muttering apologies to Jessica as if her daughter could somehow still hear. No amount of comforting words, no gentle hands on her shoulder, could awaken her from this nightmare. Even as crime scene investigators swept into the room, bags clicking, cameras flashing, footprints crinkling over hardwood, the eerie atmosphere clung to the air. The closet, spacious enough to step inside, was now sealed behind yellow police tape. The echo of the discovery lingered. Jessica, hidden in the one place meant to be secure, surrounded by her family's belongings, and yet unfathomably alone in her final moments. Something about the closet gnawed at everyone present, a mixture of disbelief, guilt, and horror. How could the family have spent days right outside this door, going about their lives as their daughter lay silently just beyond? Lingering in the air was the sickly, sweet chemical odor of decay, previously masked by scented mothballs and the brisk winter air that swept through the house when the windows were cracked open. Now, with the truth exposed, Emma realized every hint of something wrong. The strange smells, her sister's absence, her parents' anxious glances, had been pointing here all along. For the investigators, the sight within was as bizarre as it was chilling. Jessica wasn't dressed for going out. Instead, her Delta Airlines uniform was neatly folded nearby, shoes lined at the foot of the closet as though part of a well-practiced ritual. Instead, Jessica herself lay draped beneath layers of coats and scarves, positioned at a grotesque, unnatural angle, her cold skin pale against the dark hues of winter coats her mother wore for Sunday church. Around her neck was the signature navy scarf, part of her professional image, now twisted into a symbol of tragedy. The closet, once innocent, now seemed a tomb. For Emma, it would become an obsession. In the weeks following Jessica's death, she replayed the discovery constantly, haunted by what if she couldn't escape. What if she'd looked in the closet sooner? What if they'd noticed the odd placement of shoes or the sour smell that never quite left the air? What if she'd listened to her gut when that unease first crept in? Nights afterward, Emma couldn't sleep without seeing the closet door in her dreams. She'd snap awake in a cold sweat, half expecting to hear her sister's voice through the thin wooden panel or see the shadows move just out of sight. She caught herself glancing down hallways, avoiding the master bedroom, and feeling an inescapable chill, even with the heater roaring. For the whole family, closets no longer existed as simple storage space. They had become places of fear, of secrets, the last threshold before horror revealed itself. The Reed home was changed forever, its walls now holding the weight of unspoken grief and lingering bone-deep dread. The horrifying truth revealed. From the moment the closet doors swung open, a suffocating, unspeakable reality swept through the Reed household. The living room became a blur of police radios, hushed voices, and the distant cry of a siren. For the Reed family, questions spun wildly. How could this happen? Why in their seemingly safe world? But as investigators moved through the apartment, layering the scene with numbered markers and gentle commands, the all-too-dark puzzle pieces began falling into place. It started with the victim herself, Jessica, the family's shining star, discovered in the least likely of places, quietly still among the winter coats, her uniform scarf pulled tight. The forensic team moved meticulously, careful not to disturb evidence. Emma stood ghost-like at the hallway edge, watching, wishing to wake from a nightmare. But there was no waking. The smallest details now screamed with significance. The careful folding of the uniform, the untouched shoes, the work tote missing, and, most chilling, the marks around Jessica's neck where her own work scarf had been twisted and pulled until her breath gave out. The first wave of answers came from the autopsy report, delivered in the same clinical tone that could describe a sprained ankle or a run-of-the-mill flu, but what it revealed was anything but ordinary. Hemorrhaging beneath the skin indicated a struggle. Fibers from the scarf were embedded in the wounds on her neck, confirming that her death was no accident, nor was it self-inflicted. There had been a brief but violent altercation. Blood at her nose, defensive wounds on her forearms and hands, bruises along her elbows and knees, each injury a morbid testament to Jessica's desperate fight for survival. The next piece came from the apartment's state, carefully combed for prints and DNA by the crime scene unit. Several partial fingerprints found on the inside of the closet door, on the scarf's fastenings, and even on the coat hangers did not match any immediate family members. These unknown prints became an early detective obsession. There were signs of entry, but nothing as overt as a broken window or forced latch, just the faint trace of a muddy boot print on the inside sill of a bedroom window, a detail not even the most paranoid family member would have thought to check. In parallel, police canvassed the building, questioning neighbors and combing through security footage. One neighbor recalled hearing a brief argument drifting from the Reed apartment days prior, but thought nothing of it amid the familiar soundtrack of city living. Another resident vaguely remembered someone unfamiliar, anxious, purposeful, lingering near the elevator. But concrete leads were frustratingly thin. Detectives retraced Jessica's final known movements, piecing together her last days hour by hour. She'd been seen coming home after her flight, carrying her signature work tote, looking exhausted but polite to the doorman. There were no reports of visitors, no deliveries, nothing out of the ordinary logged by the building's front desk or cameras at the main entrance, until a shadowy figure surfaced on a single camera covering a back stairwell. Grainy footage revealed a man in a dark hoodie and jeans, entering the stairwell and slipping out half an hour later. The timestamp precisely mirrored the window when Jessica was last known to be alive. Homicide investigators dug further. They scoured Jessica's phone records, quickly discovering a series of unanswered calls and cryptic text messages from an unidentified number in the days leading up to her death. Some were pleading in tone, others abruptly angry. When they traced the number, it led to a prepaid burner phone, a dead end, but clearly belonging to someone who didn't want to be found. The messages hinted at a fraught relationship. "Please talk to me. You don't have to do this. Don't hang up." Emma, desperate for answers, pored over Jessica's journals and laptop with police permission. There were scattered references to someone named K, a person Jessica had recently blocked on social media after weeks of escalated harassment and unwanted contact. It became unmistakably clear that Jessica had been living in growing fear. She'd written late-night entries about strange noises in the hallway, seeing her ex-boyfriend's face in passing cabs, dark dreams of being followed, and a chilling sense that no lock was thick enough to keep certain demons out. The case's breakthrough came faster than anyone expected, thanks in part to forensic technology and Jessica's meticulous record-keeping. Investigators recovered a long strand of dark hair from Jessica's coat collar, along with microscopic fibers that matched fabric samples from a jacket Jessica's ex-boyfriend Kevin Sullivan was often seen wearing in his social media photographs. The partial prints in the closet, checked against a national database, found their match. Kevin, who had a prior record for misdemeanor harassment, information he'd always managed to minimize or conceal. Confronted with mounting evidence, Kevin at first denied everything, feigning heartbreak over Jessica's accident, but detectives weren't fooled. They presented him with the irrefutable DNA match, the cell phone data placing him within a mile of Jessica's apartment on the night of her death, and the security footage showing his distinctive limp from a long-ago sports injury as he left the building. The facade cracked. Under pressure, Kevin confessed, but in typical fashion, he blamed Jessica, painting himself as a victim spurned, humiliated, provoked. The truth, though, was straightforward and brutal. Jessica had tried to end all contact after Kevin's erratic possessive behavior escalated into threats. She'd refused him entry, told him she was moving on, and when he couldn't accept that, he forced his way inside, where a sudden ugly argument turned violent. In a final act of rage, Kevin used Jessica's beloved airline scarf, intending to silence her forever with the same symbol of her independence and new life. For Emma, those facts landed like physical blows. Each new detail forced her to rethink not only Jessica's last days, but months. Every late-night phone call, every reassured smile, the feigned nonchalance about secret texts, the sudden insistence on checking the locks. Emma remembered her own frustration. She had accused Jessica of overreacting, of letting her imagination run wild. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, that skepticism haunted her. The trial that followed re-traumatized the family, as lawyers argued over Jessica's character and the events of that dreadful night. Yet the forensic evidence stood resolute: Jessica's fight for survival, Kevin's presence, the messages, the digital breadcrumbs he left behind in his attempts to cover his tracks. The jury found little room for doubt. Ultimately, Jessica's killer was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the Reed family, no verdict, no prison sentence, could restore what was lost. The truth was finally laid bare, but it was a truth that left scars. On Emma, who had lived in Jessica's shadow and missed the signs. On Marjorie and Walter, who replayed every moment leading up to the loss of their daughter, wrestling with impossible questions about protection, safety, and blame. In the broader sense, the story became more than just a family tragedy. Jessica's death was a cold, sharp warning for countless young women living, loving, and working in a world where their achievements and independence sometimes sparked dangerous resentment. Her friends and colleagues spoke out about the silent epidemic of harassment and coercion. Local advocacy groups hosted workshops on workplace safety, stalking awareness, and domestic violence. In the wake of the horrifying truth, the community slowly stirred toward change, even as the Reeds learned, day by day, how to survive with the knowledge that tragedy had, however inexplicably, chosen their home. A perfect family on the outside, but unable to avoid tragedy. From the outside, the Reed family looked precisely like the archetype New York success story. Within the warmly lit walls of their apartment, photos lined the mantel. Emma as a curly-haired child at school science fairs, her older sister Jessica in her crisp blue airline uniform, middle sister Lily with a violin tucked shyly under her chin. Their parents, Walter and Marjorie, were professionals. He a long-standing attorney who never missed a parent-teacher conference. She a preschool educator beloved by families in the neighborhood. To neighbors, friends, and even extended family, the Reeds seemed to have meticulously checked every box. Achievement, stability, community involvement, and the kind of love that can be felt in a casual glance or a shared laugh across the dinner table. Jessica, the eldest, was especially admired not just by her sisters, but by a whole network of relatives and friends. She had blazed a path, honor roll high school student, first in the family to travel abroad, and eventually a sought-after flight attendant for one of the nation's top airlines. Emma idolized her. To her, Jessica was unflappable, someone who could manage crying toddlers at 35,000 feet and rowdy businessmen in midair with equal poise. Family conversations often revolved around Jessica's stories, her adventures in cities Emma and Lily could only dream of visiting, the passengers she'd quietly helped, and the grace with which she carried the family's immigrant hopes on her slender shoulders. Lily, the middle child, was quieter, perhaps more bookish, fond of her life overseas but doting when home. She was the glue in her own subtle way, texting from London at odd hours to check in, ensuring the three sisters' bond stayed powerful despite the Atlantic between them. Emma, after Jessica's passing, would replay those gentle messages, realizing how desperately they all leaned on one another, even when life seemed so full, so stable on the surface. But whatever sense of perfection the household projected was always more fragile than it appeared. Their routines held comfort but also masked stress. Walter's workload left him chronically sleep-deprived. Marjorie's patience was sometimes tested by difficult parents at school, or the ache of missing her far-flung daughters. Jessica worried about making ends meet on unpredictable airline hours, worn thin by jet lag and the burden of maintaining a perfect facade for passengers and her own family alike. Still, family lore painted a resilient picture. Weekend breakfasts were sacred, a chance for everyone to sit, linger, and share news. Holidays took on mythic proportions, with homemade dishes and gifts often representing not just tradition, but tangible proof that their families' sacrifices in immigrating, struggling, and thriving were not in vain. To anyone peering in from the outside, it was a home overflowing with warmth and joy. In truth, it was a home full of invisible cracks, subtle tensions, unspoken anxieties, and attempts to shield pain from others so as not to burden those you love most. Jessica, above all, held herself to impossible standards. She rarely let on when she was exhausted or overwhelmed. Her sisters would later reminisce about her late-night chats and how even then, Jessica would deflect concern, telling stories to make others laugh rather than sharing her own struggles. She was everyone's champion, Emma's confidant, Lily's role model, Marjorie's helper, and Walter's pride. But as the reality of loss settled over the family like a living fog, each realized just how hard Jessica had worked to protect them from the darker corners of her own life. After tragedy struck, the gap between outward image and inner life became a wound that would not heal. Neighbors at first tiptoed by the apartment, unsure what to say to a family whose daughter had suddenly become a headline. Friends tried to offer casseroles, whispered reassurances, and averted eyes. Emma, still reeling, found herself angered by the word perfect. What does it mean to be a perfect family when even that can be torn to pieces by someone else's obsession? When no amount of love, support, or accomplishment can shield you from random or targeted violence? When the world expects you to bounce back simply because you seemed like the kind of family who always would? Walter became haunted by the details of every day leading up to the tragic loss. He replayed breakfast table conversations, Jessica's routines, the last meaningful eye contact they shared, searching again and again for a sign he'd missed. Marjorie, her foundation shaken, poured herself into work more deeply, struggling to face the haunting emptiness in her own kitchen. Lily, an ocean away, wrestled with guilt over not having been there, replaying voicemails and texts at dawn, unable to find closure so far from home. And Emma, carrying the torch now as the youngest, wondered if she would ever again believe in the safety she once took for granted. Grief manifested in unpredictable ways. Sometimes it was a sharp, bracing thing, like Marjorie bursting into tears in the produce aisle at the sight of Jessica's favorite fruit. Sometimes it was numbing, as when Walter drifted through days in a fog of legal files and coffee. The apartment felt both too full and too empty at once, Jessica's presence lingering like perfume in her old room, her voice alive only in Emma's dreams. Lily, once the strong one, caught herself crying on London sidewalks, feeling utterly exposed among strangers. Family friends would sometimes confide how the Reed tragedy made them aware of their own hidden fragilities. A neighbor confessed she'd begun double-checking her locks and spending too much time wondering whether her college-age daughter shared the same risk. Old friends from church or school dropped off care packages, sometimes pausing in the entryway as if waiting for the old house to reappear, not sure how to confront the new silence that greeted them. But in the months and years that followed, the Reeds found that true strength lay not in perfection, but in honesty, allowing themselves to mourn, to rage, and to lean on one another and their community. Emma learned to reach out for support and not hide her tears. Walter quietly started attending a father's grief group, even when he doubted it would help. Marjorie started speaking about Jessica's life, her joys and her struggles. At school parent forums, helping other families bridge their own silences. Lily brought her mother to London for a summer, rebuilding trust and connection far from the place where everything had changed. Their apartment remained, with all the photographs, old and new, side by side. The perfect image was gone, but a more real one emerged. A family forever altered but unbroken, stumbling forward one day at a time, finding hope and meaning not in being untouched by tragedy but in surviving it together and honoring the memory of the daughter and sister they all loved so fiercely. Investigating stress and technological turning points. The aftermath of Jessica Reed's death cast a shadow over the entire Reed household and radiated outward through the surrounding community, prompting a full-scale investigation the likes of which their Midtown Manhattan precinct had rarely seen. NYPD detectives assigned to the case quickly realized this was no ordinary missing persons report or domestic tragedy. Every detail pointed to a calculated act, and the pressure to provide answers for the family, the media, and the airline community was immense. From the very onset, investigators recognized that emotional distress and grief could create gaps and distortions in witness recollection. The Reed family's testimonies about those final few days were painstakingly gathered. Emma's detailed account of Jessica's unease, her father Walter's recollection of the odd smells and missing tote, and Marjorie's memories of kitchen conversations all became part of the official record. But the detectives quickly learned that this case couldn't be cracked by memory alone. It was technology, data, surveillance, digital footprints, that would ultimately unlock the mysteries surrounding Jessica's demise. The search began with the basics: security camera footage, building swipe records, and digital communications. The Reed family's apartment was in a secure building, one that prided itself on modern amenities, including a 24-hour doorman and a comprehensive surveillance system. Detectives pulled hours of security footage from every angle surrounding the Reeds' apartment and the communal lobby, painstakingly searching for anything out of the ordinary during the timeline Jessica might have last been seen alive. Their first major challenge was the sheer volume of footage and data. Multiple tenants, visitors, and deliveries came and went at all hours. Still, the investigators' eyes were trained for patterns, for anomalies that would escape the notice of ordinary residents. Lead detective Angie Morales camped out in the precinct for sleepless nights, running timestamp checks and poring over videos with her team. That's where technology gave the breaking edge. Modern facial recognition algorithms, paired with motion sensing software, processed hours of footage in a matter of minutes. The software flagged one instance, at 5:46 p.m. on the evening before Jessica's discovery, a figure in a dark hoodie and baseball cap entering the building via a rarely used service door. The person kept their head low, avoiding the regular lobby cameras, and took the back stairwell to the family's floor. Roughly 40 minutes later, the same figure was seen exiting in the same discreet manner. Cross-referencing building access logs confirmed there was no registered guest or delivery scheduled during that window. But the apartment's own security, locks, alarms showed no sign of forced entry. That meant Jessica likely knew her killer, or else had been tricked into opening the door. Detectives pivoted to the digital trail, cell tower pings, social media posts, phone records, and, crucially, Jessica's laptop. Forensic analysts created a clone of her hard drive and uncovered a pattern of escalating harassment from an untraceable burner phone. The content of these messages ranged from pleading apologies to outright threats, a digital mosaic of obsession. At the same time, analysis of Emma and Marcus's messages with Jessica confirmed details about the anxious atmosphere in the days leading to her murder without redundancy or overlap with their own memories shared with police. The family's Wi-Fi logs revealed one more anomaly. On the night in question, there was a short burst of activity from an unknown device, later correlated to the same hours when the hoodie-clad visitor had arrived. The device accessed public Wi-Fi and appeared to have pinged a rideshare app moments before vanishing from the network entirely. The digital forensics team, working with the rideshare provider, backtracked the request. The account had been made that same day, under a false name, and paid for with a prepaid debit card. This led to a second wave of digital sleuthing, a process that drew in law enforcement liaisons from the rideshare company, cell phone providers, and banking networks. Piece by painstaking piece, they constructed a digital map of the suspect's movements before and after the incident, tying together his physical presence at the Reed apartment with data breadcrumbs left behind by modern life. Each step of the way, new forensic search warrants brought the puzzle closer to completion. Meanwhile, attention turned to the physical evidence overlooked on the initial night in the apartment. Crime scene techs, already wrestling with media pressure, returned repeatedly to handle trace evidence collection, using advanced luminol sprays and vacuum dust examinations in the master bedroom closet and hallway. A muddy shoe print, faint but present, was lifted near the radiator below the window, a direct contradiction to the perfectly staged living spaces elsewhere in the apartment. Further chemical analysis identified trace fibers clinging to Jessica's scarf, matching the fabric of the hoodie observed in the video footage. For the community and the family, the investigation seemed agonizingly slow. Every day spent waiting for a break was another day spent mourning in helpless uncertainty. Detective Morales made it a point to update the Reeds daily, ensuring transparency but also compassion. She never minimized the family's pain, instead treating them as allies in the search for justice. At the precinct, the case became a rallying point. Analysts skipped lunch to review phone records. Patrol officers canvassed the block for witnesses who might have noticed the stranger. The city's news media, starved for updates, speculated about possible motives and suspects, ratcheting up public anxiety. The investigative turning point came when a match finally surfaced between the partial fingerprint on the inside closet door and a suspect already flagged by the digital investigation, Kevin Sullivan. He was Jessica's ex-boyfriend, already the source of concern in her blocked messages and written anxieties. Police found surveillance footage of Kevin using a rideshare to get within a block of the Reed residence on the night in question, his limp unmistakable on camera. Combined with matched fiber and DNA evidence, the chain of technology-driven discoveries closed around him. The arrest, when it came, was a carefully orchestrated operation. FBI cybercrime agents called in for their expertise, coordinated with NYPD units to track Kevin's device usage. At dawn one morning, Officers intercepted him at a rental apartment in New Jersey, where he was living under a different name. In his possession was the same burner phone that had been used to torment Jessica, locked away, but damning in its metadata and message archives. When confronted, Kevin denied involvement, but faced with forensic evidence, the digital timelines and detailed questioning, his narrative crumbled. Technological breakthroughs, while powerful, never lessened the human cost. Emma often lay awake replaying each investigative update, hoping for a sign that her sister would find peace in this relentless pursuit of the truth. Marjorie and Walter attended nearly every procedural hearing, both humbled and haunted by the lengths modern investigators would go to for justice. For them, plaintext cell records and digital breadcrumbs became bittersweet tokens, proof of how connected yet how vulnerable their supposedly secure lives had become. In the end, the investigation set a new precedent. It demonstrated how, in the digital age, traces are left everywhere, and justice could follow even the faintest signals through the noise. For the Reed family, the technological breakthrough brought accountability, but their sense of loss remained immeasurable. A family forever divided between an irretrievable past and a future built on memories, answers, and finally, the hope for healing. The appearance of an old flame and a painful motive. The grainy footage from the apartment building's security camera replayed in the detective's office over and over. It captured a familiar figure slipping quietly through the back stairwell, Kevin Nguyen. When the truth finally surfaced, it was less a surprise and more a chilling confirmation of the undercurrents that had run beneath Anna's last weeks. To everyone on the outside, Kevin seemed like an ideal former boyfriend, a medical student from a reputable Dallas family, polished, sociable, and impossibly charming at first glance. He had once been central to Anna's world, their early romance full of promise, shared goals, inside jokes, and dreams of a dazzling future. Friends still remembered double dates, holiday trips, and the way Anna would light up when Kevin walked into a room. But by the end, the relationship had turned into something tighter, darker, and suffocating. The breakup wasn't just difficult, it was a severance Anna had to force, and one Kevin refused to accept. What started with constant phone calls and anxious texts quickly escalated. Kevin's concern for Anna's well-being took a possessive, haunting turn. He questioned her every movement, asking who she was with, why she didn't reply instantly, and demanding explanations for the smallest inconsistencies, always rationalized as love as fear of losing her. Anna's close friends noticed how her once easygoing spirit became clouded with second-guessing. If she wanted a night out with the girls or to visit her family, she'd brace herself for Kevin's interrogations afterwards. Slowly her enthusiasm faded, replaced by the careful, exhausted control of someone always watching their back. The more Anna tried to end things with compassion and logic, the more Kevin unraveled. His messages became emotionally volatile, one moment apologetic and loving, the next furious. He began showing up unexpectedly at places Anna frequented, from her gym to the grocery store near her block. There were times she even spotted him waiting outside her building, pretending coincidental meetings while pressing for another chance. Her friends pleaded with her to consider seeking help, but Anna felt caught between protecting herself and not wanting to expose the worst parts of their shared story. The dark spiral finally forced Anna's hand. She changed her number, blocked his social media accounts, and asked her building staff not to let Kevin in. For a time things went quiet, but Anna confided to her sister and a handful of friends that she never felt fully at ease. She kept checking over her shoulder, making sure her door was locked, wondering each night if she really was safe. Beneath the measured mask of his daily life, Kevin's resentment pooled. He struggled with mounting debts from school, family pressure to succeed, and the loss of Anna, his anchor and his possession. In his mind, Anna owed him an explanation, a second chance, something to restore his pride. Each mention of her on social media, every photo of her smiling with friends, became proof she was moving on without him, fueling a cocktail of jealousy, anger, and panic. In conversations with his acquaintances, Kevin downplayed the breakup. But in private he nursed his fixation. He started using burner phones to continue contacting Anna, cycling through numbers when she blocked him. His messages grew increasingly disturbing. "I just want closure. You'll regret ignoring me. We're supposed to be together, can't you see that?" The investigation's breakthrough was as much technological as psychological. Reviewing months of texts, call logs, and surveillance, detectives pieced together the relentless pattern: unwanted contact, stalking behavior, subtle digital threats. Reports from Anna's building security detailed at least 3 occasions when Kevin was seen lurking near the service entrance or in the parking lot, each time leaving hastily when approached. For Anna, each interaction chipped away at her sense of safety. She wrote in her journal about feeling trapped, not just by Kevin's presence but by the guilt and shame his manipulation produced. "Maybe I should talk to him just one more time, for closure," she scribbled, "but I'm scared it'll never be enough." Those around her watched, powerless to intervene as Kevin's persistence veered into obsession. The night Kevin returned was carefully calculated, not impulsive. Trackers later reconstructed his route, purchasing a one-way bus ticket from Dallas, arriving in New York 2 days earlier, booking a budget hotel under a false name, and moving through the city purposefully, always incognito. That night, police discovered, he waited in the shadows by Anna's building until the doorman stepped away. He used a spare keycard, a remnant from happier times never turned in, to gain entrance. Their final confrontation lasted only minutes, but its effects would reverberate forever. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices, the thump of something heavy, and a woman's muffled pleas, but dismissed it as a lover's spat or the normal chaos of city living. By the time Kevin fled the scene, careful to wipe his fingerprints and gather any personal effects, he'd already destroyed the world he once claimed to love most. Detectives in their interviews with Kevin after his arrest found layers of denial and self-justification. He described loving Anna too much, saying she had driven him to it by refusing reconciliation. He insisted he only wanted closure, a final conversation, a promise that he wasn't the villain. Even as the evidence mounted, surveillance footage, DNA traces, burner phone records, and witness statements, Kevin alternated between rage and tears, never able to fully confront the horror of what he'd done. For Anna's family, learning these truths was as devastating as losing her in the first place. The idea that someone they'd welcomed into their home had harbored such darkness was a scar that would never fully heal. Emma, her sister, combed through messages and memories, tormented by every warning sign she'd missed. Anna's parents felt betrayed by their own hospitality, remembering holiday dinners where Kevin fit seamlessly into their family photos, never once hinting at the possibility of violence. In the aftermath, the broader community was forced to reckon with the uncomfortable reality that obsession, jealousy, and untreated hurt can twist love into something monstrous. Anna's colleagues, fellow flight attendants, and friends became fierce advocates for recognizing the red flags of unhealthy attachment. Her name became a rallying cry in campaigns against stalking and domestic abuse, a legacy her family never sought but ultimately embraced in her honor. Looking at Kevin Nguyen's face in court, Anna's family saw not just a criminal but a personification of all the warning signs they'd been taught to underestimate. He was capable, charismatic, and deeply broken, proof that beneath perfect surfaces, pain can fester until it poisons everything in its path. Their grief became a call for honesty, vigilance, and courage, a plea to never ignore the subtle ways that ordinary love can sometimes hide the seeds of unimaginable tragedy. The painful truth revealed. In the days and weeks following Anna's murder, the raw, painful truth of what really happened slowly emerged piece by piece. It was not a revelation that came all at once like the crash of a gavel or the flick of a light switch. Instead, the agony seeped into the lives of Anna's family, her friends, and the wider community in increments, each new detail deepening the wound, each passing hour cementing the irrevocable loss. The investigation by police and forensic specialists left little room for denial. There was no tragic accident, no chance encounter. The evidence was meticulous and relentless. Anna's cell phone records told a silent tale of harassment, endless calls and messages from Kevin, the man she had once loved. Her phone showed a final burst of activity as she desperately tried to dial for help in her last minutes. The autopsy, so clinical, so detached, cataloged not just the violence that ended Anna's life, but also the marks of her resistance and will to survive. Defensive wounds, bruising, and the unmistakable marks left by the scarf around her neck told the silent story that Anna had fought until the bitter end. At home, Anna's family faced the harrowing task of sorting through the remnants of her life. The bedroom was just as she left it, makeup brushes lined up on the vanity, books stacked on the nightstand, an unfinished cup of coffee growing cold. Her favorite blanket was folded at the foot of the bed, a gentle reminder of her rituals. Every object became a kind of accusation. Why hadn't they seen? How could they have protected her better? What sign had they overlooked? Sarah, Anna's younger sister, found herself rereading the last text Anna had sent her, a simple, "Call you in the morning," over and over, trying to hear her voice in the words. Meanwhile, news of Anna's death and the grim circumstances surrounding it began leaking into the press, fueling both outrage and fear. Reporters staked out the building. Neighbors speculated in hushed tones by the elevator and in the lobby, their whispers full of what-ifs and theories. For every person who expressed horror at Anna's fate, there was another who asked, could it have been prevented? Many questioned the building's security, the police's initial response, and even hinted, with the cruelty unique to those distanced from tragedy, that Anna must have done something to invite such obsession. The family, already shattered, had to process not only their private pain, but the public's unrelenting curiosity and speculation. Hours at the police station merged with hours at the funeral home. Anna's parents were forced to make impossible decisions, selecting a casket, planning a memorial, answering questions from the police about the intimate details of Anna's relationships and last days. Each step was surreal, as if they were actors in someone else's nightmare. At Anna's funeral, the church overflowed with friends, co-workers, strangers moved by the news, and the sudden, overwhelming awareness of how close to home such violence could reside. Eulogies were delivered by trembling hands, their words full of questions that could never be fully answered. Why her? Why now? Why wasn't it enough for Anna to simply say no and be left in peace? The depth of the truth, the fact that the very person Anna tried to escape had taken everything from her, sent shockwaves. Her friends and family struggled to come to terms with the knowledge that Kevin's seemingly earnest remorse, his polite demeanor, and his outward composure had masked something so dangerous. It was as if the world itself had flipped upside down. Nothing could be trusted, not even the familiar faces at Thanksgiving, or the words of comfort from people who claimed they would have seen the signs. For Anna's mother, every day was a battle to stop replaying the last days and weeks leading up to the murder. She recalled every conversation with Anna, the way her daughter's voice had tightened when speaking about the breakup, the hints of anxiety she'd tried to brush away, the moments when Anna insisted everything was fine. Her father spent long nights at the kitchen table, sifting through police reports and timeline reconstructions, torturing himself with details. Sarah fell prey to guilt. Was she too wrapped up in her own life to notice her sister was in danger? She replayed every phone call, every time she'd dismissed Anna's fears as the natural sting of a breakup. Kevin's arrest offered little relief. His confession, chilling in its lack of emotion, didn't bring closure so much as it closed a chapter, one marked by grief and rage. Anna's family had to endure the spectacle of a trial, with defense lawyers picking over Anna's life and motivations in ways that felt invasive and cruel. The specifics of the violence, the litany of threats and manipulations, and the clinical examination of Anna's final moments were exposed in cold legal language, draining even more humanity from her story. Friends testified, some breaking down on the stand. The media continued their coverage, the tone shifting from sympathy to salaciousness as details emerged. The ripple effect spread further still. Anna's workplace reeled with the shock, especially her colleagues in the airline industry. Many had seen signs of her stress but had underestimated the risk, restating the uncomfortable truth that even the most vigilant communities can miss the warning signs of intimate partner violence. Some of Anna's friends gathered to launch awareness campaigns, determined that her story would prevent future tragedies. Her case became a talking point on national television, debated by pundits who often missed the nuance in favor of sound bites. As winter turned to spring, the Reed apartment remained haunted by Anna's absence. Her laughter and energy had been its lifeblood. Holidays loomed as reminders of newfound emptiness. Over time, each family member began to develop their own rituals for remembrance. Sarah and her parents would light a candle in Anna's room. Her mother often visited places Anna had loved, leaving small bouquets in her memory. There were grief counseling sessions and support groups, and slow, faltering steps toward internal peace. But the sense of injustice never truly faded. The pain of knowing Anna had done everything within her power to break away and still paid the ultimate price. The truth about Anna's death in all its painful detail remained a heavy legacy. No comforting narrative could be built around it. Just the hard reality that even in the safest homes and among the most loving families, hidden shadows can lurk, and the monsters sometimes wear faces that once brought joy. The Reed family, forever changed, became advocates for education on dating violence and the vital importance of believing victims. Through their grief, they found a painful clarity. Acknowledging the truth does not erase trauma, but it can offer a path to healing for themselves and perhaps for others who might recognize a similar danger before it is too late. Justice and its irreparable consequences. In the months and years that followed the trial, the Reed family's reality split into two distinct worlds, one governed by the cold metrics of justice, the other haunted by the unyielding ache of loss. Kevin's conviction and the imposition of a life sentence without the possibility of parole was met with palpable relief by many. Prosecutors called it a resounding victory. Advocates cited it as a rare example of the system working, and journalists packaged the outcome into neat, digestible headlines. But for those left in the wreckage, the so-called triumph of justice brought little comfort. Inside the courthouse, the judgment itself played out with both clinical efficiency and raw human drama. The Reed family sat together in the front pew as the verdict was read. Emma gripped her father's hand so tightly that both turned pale. Marjorie's face was a mask that oscillated between stoicism and barely contained sobs. As the judge listed Kevin's crimes, breaking and entering, aggravated assault, first-degree murder, the legal language seemed to offer a tidy narrative, as if the events could finally be compartmentalized, filed, and one day forgotten. But the reality was more complicated. For weeks after the sentencing, the Reed apartment was flooded with flowers, cards, and well-meaning messages. Strangers from around the city, moved by media reports, sent notes of support or posted online tributes to Anna's memory. Several advocacy groups reached out with offers: grief counselors, legal aid, survivor support circles. In public, the family nodded and thanked, their faces fixed into polite, exhausted gratitude. In private, each member stumbled through a landscape profoundly reshaped by violence. The first and most obvious consequence was the crushing silence. Anna's laughter had once infused the home with life. Now, everyday routines, morning coffee, the whir of the dishwasher, footsteps in the hallway, sounded like echoes in a mausoleum. Each parent coped differently. Marjorie threw herself into long shifts at the preschool, insisting she needed to stay busy lest the grief consume her. Walter, the steadfast lawyer, stopped taking on major cases for months, paralyzed by the guilt of not having kept his family safe. Emma, juggling her own studies and the pressure of holding the family together, drifted through days in a fog of anxiety and nightmares. Compounding the pain was a constant undercurrent of what if? What if they had acted more decisively when Anna first voiced her fears? What if Emma had asked one more question the last time her sister seemed distracted? What if the system had done more? That the police had taken the early harassment more seriously, or the building had stricter protocols for ex-tenants and keycards? Every member of the family became an amateur investigator, reconstructing the past for clues in a futile attempt to change it. But the past would not yield. Its verdict was as final as the judge's gavel. As weeks turned into months, new rituals formed around their grief. Anna's old bedroom became a softly lit shrine where her mother would replace fresh flowers on the desk each Saturday morning and lay out her favorite scarf on the pillow. On anniversaries and holidays, the family gathered to share stories, not of Anna's death but of her life, her quirks, her kindness, as if to reclaim her from the headline that had overtaken her identity. Yet the costs of the tragedy rippled far beyond the family. Walter and Marjorie's marriage, always strong, came under strain as each struggled to understand grief in their own way. Arguments surfaced over parenting, over what safety meant, over whether Emma should take a job that would send her out of state. Sometimes the sorrow drew them closer, often it pushed them apart, each heart too heavy for the other to bear. For Emma, the impact played out in a dizzying mix of resilience and fragility. She excelled in her classes for a time, determined to show she could overcome. But the weight of Anna's absence, her confidant, her role model, often proved too great. There were panic attacks before big presentations, nights spent staring at old photos or scrolling through saved messages, searching for comfort in digital ghosts. Trust, once easy, became nearly impossible. She questioned the motives of classmates, friends, acquaintances, always wary, always half expecting the darkness to re-emerge. For every new connection she forged, there was a voice in her head reminding her how easily safety could unravel. Meanwhile, the community struggled with its own set of irreparable consequences. The building management replaced locks and rewrote guest protocols in direct response to Anna's death, an overdue but necessary gesture. Neighbors organized vigils and attended town hall meetings addressing personal safety and violence prevention. Some residents, particularly young women, confessed to feeling permanently unsettled in their own homes. For months after the verdict, conversations in the lobby and at local coffee shops often circled back to the question, how had such darkness gone unnoticed among them for so long? Colleagues in the airline industry too carried Anna's memory forward. The union organized workshops on stalking and intimate partner violence, inviting outside experts and providing anonymous counseling hotlines. Friends from training classes and cabin crews hung ribbons in her favorite colors on their suitcases. Anna's story, her bright spirit and shocking demise, became a case study in safety seminars, a cautionary tale whispered on commuter flights across the country. Social media kept Anna's memory alive, but also amplified pain in new and unexpected ways. Every anniversary unleashed a fresh wave of in memoriam posts, photos, and tributes, many from people who never knew her, others from those who clung to her memory for fear of forgetting. The family appreciated the good intentions but sometimes felt ambushed by the reminders, unable to control when and how their private suffering became public content. Beyond grief there was also anger, an itch beneath the skin that would not fade. Walter would sometimes rant late into the night about loopholes in restraining order laws, or rally lawmakers to consider tighter restrictions on keycard access for apartment buildings. Marjorie joined a parent coalition, lobbying schools to supplement curricula with resources on relationship red flags and digital safety. Emma gravitated toward activism, volunteering her time at a crisis center for victims of domestic abuse, channeling her rage and regret into something like purpose. But no matter how noble these efforts, healing was not linear. Each new initiative reminded them of the void at its source, a daughter, a sister, a friend who would never again walk through the door. The emotional toll was matched by lasting psychological consequences. Walter quietly began seeing a therapist for the first time in his life, processing layers of guilt and despair he could never fully share with his wife or daughter. Marjorie's insomnia grew worse, leading to a string of sleepless nights and exhausted days. Emma's anxiety developed into post-traumatic stress, exacerbated by the scrutiny of both the public and her own expectations. They all became reluctant experts in trauma. They spoke the language of symptoms and healing, triggers and recovery. Sometimes, hope would emerge in the smallest moments, a family dinner that brought laughter instead of tears, a letter from one of Anna's childhood friends, an act of kindness from a stranger who'd read her story. These glimmers of joy served as much-needed reminders that the world, even when punctured by cruelty, could still harbor grace. Ultimately, justice, when viewed from a distance, felt like a paradox. The law had done its duty. Kevin would never harm another soul, at least not beyond the prison walls. The evidence was heard, due process followed, sentences passed, but no verdict could restore what was lost. The Reed family would never get Anna back, the world would never celebrate a new chapter in her life. The sentence was final for Kevin, but for the survivors there was no such closure. Only the slow, unsteady recalibration of life after devastation. They learned, painfully, that justice could punish the guilty, but it could never undo the irrevocable consequences of violence. A warning for modern American society. In the aftermath of tragedy, after the sirens fade and headlines move on, there remains a hard question echoing throughout modern American society. How did we get here? And what, if anything, will we do differently? Anna's story, wrenching and deeply personal, is not an outlier. Instead, it exposes a set of truths lurking beneath the glossy image of progress and safety that so many wish to believe defines American life. For all its affluence and freedoms, the United States remains haunted by the twin specters of toxic possessiveness and silence in the face of escalating domestic threat. The narrative of Anna, a strong, independent woman who worked her way up, cherished by her immigrant family and admired by her peers, should have represented the American dream at its best. Instead, her murder at the hands of a former partner exposes cracks in that dream. It's an indictment of the cultural undercurrents that reward ambition but fail to protect the ambitious from old patterns of misogyny, jealousy, and refusal to respect boundaries. The privacy and self-reliance valued by society can become isolation, especially when someone faces intimate violence or psychological abuse. Anna's fate is a sobering reminder that the markers of success, good jobs, supportive families, locked doors, and layers of technology, are sometimes powerless against deep-rooted cultural failures. At its very core, this tragedy forces society to ask, why is intimate partner violence, stalking, and coercive control still so rarely recognized for the danger it truly represents? Too often, possessive behavior is minimized as heartbreak, warning signs are dismissed as melodrama, and cries for help get swept aside by a system overwhelmed and undertrained. Anna's incremental efforts, changing her number, blocking her ex, alerting her building, were the steps every advice column prescribes. What is so uncomfortably clear is how those right steps are only a patch against a world that too often blames victims or doubts their perceptions until it's too late. In a society shaped by stories of self-made women and tales of empowerment, there remains a stubborn resistance to acknowledging the full scale of gender-based violence. Media coverage often veers between sensationalism and subtle victim blaming. Was she too trusting? Was there warning? Did she seek help soon enough? All those questions, spoken aloud or whispered online, reflect a reluctance to grapple with what makes American society particularly vulnerable: its expectation that private matters should remain private, that women must be endlessly resilient, and that male heartbreak can excuse controlling behavior. Anna's story points to the urgent need for education, prevention, and cultural change. Domestic violence is not a problem cloistered in the shadows. It cuts across neighborhoods, incomes, backgrounds, and professions. High-rise buildings with doormen and security cameras offer no real sanctuary if society continues to excuse or rationalize obsession and control. Each time a parent, friend, or bystander hesitates to intervene or question a troubling relationship, each time the public narrative lets a killer's excuses stand, we pave the way for another victim to be lost. But if the horror of Anna's case can offer anything, it is a wake-up call, one that rattles all the way from the most intimate family table to the halls of law enforcement, corporate leadership, and federal governance. There must be a shift, recognizing stalking as the precursor to violence it so often is, taking every report of harassment with the seriousness it truly warrants, and providing meaningful access to intervention long before things reach a crisis point. The legal system, as thorough as it tries to be after the fact, needs to turn its gaze upstream, making protective measures not only easier to access, but also automatic in certain high-threat scenarios. Family courts, police departments, and social service agencies must be trained and resourced to read between the lines of reports, to see behind the words relationship trouble or breakup, and understand the potential for escalation. Equally pressing is the cultural side of the equation. Early education, at home and in schools, must be blunt and persistent about healthy boundaries, warning signs of coercion, and the dangers that accompany unchecked jealousy. It's not enough to simply teach young people about consent. There must be open discussions about possessiveness, digital stalking, revenge, and the real-life costs of refusing to let go. Men in particular need new models of vulnerability, ones that turn away from dominance and control as responses to hurt, and instead foster empathy, communication, and mutual respect. Parents must not only watch over their children but also teach them to trust their own instincts and to speak up when they are afraid, confused, or feel trapped by love that hurts more than it heals. Workplaces and communities can't exempt themselves from this conversation. Airlines and other large employers must make it possible for employees to report threats, whether overt or implied, without fear of retaliation or being stigmatized as troublemakers. Policies should support, not penalize, those seeking restraining orders, changing schedules for safety, or even taking time away from work to address domestic conflicts. Managers, supervisors, and HR professionals must be trained to respond compassionately and proactively when an employee's well-being is at risk. And beyond policies, there must be a cultural commitment to stand with survivors, not distance from them. Anna's loss does not belong to just her family or friends, it belongs to the larger fabric of a country struggling to reconcile its values of freedom and personal safety with the realities of violence that cross every social divide. The growing patchwork of online advocacy, support groups, and new legal protections shows that progress is possible, but it is far from complete. The debates sparked by her story can't end at hashtags and memorials. They must continue in city councils, school board meetings, community centers, and courtrooms. Real transformation requires stamina, the willingness to look unflinchingly into the darkest corners, and the humility to admit past failures. For every Anna, every daughter, sister, mother, or friend lost to avoidable violence, there is a duty to break cycles of silence and complicity. This is the work of an impatient generation that demands more than symbolic gestures, and of elders who must finally reckon with the ways old customs can enable harm. Even as grief lingers, Anna's legacy sharpens into a manifesto. The promise that change is not just needed, but possible, if enough people link arms and refuse to let this be just another story buried beneath tomorrow's headlines. In the end, the call to action is clear. The tragedy that claimed Anna's life should galvanize every sector, education, law, family, and public policy, to treat intimate partner violence as both a crisis and a collective responsibility. Protecting the next Anna, the next family, the next bright light at risk will test the heart of American society. May her story be the catalyst for true change, a wake-up call no one can unhear and no generation can afford to ignore.